time to head back into the world of Android-based handhelds with Anbernic's RG556. And I'm definitely excited to be able to feature this handheld for the first time on the channel, which has a beautiful 5.5-inch OLED display and is powered by the Unisoc T820. We've got a bit of firsts here with this video as we explore the capabilities of the T820, the Anbernic RG556, and the Nintendo Switch emulator Sudachi for Android, which, like my current hometown of Phoenix, Arizona, has been reborn from the ashes of Yuzu and hopefully will continue the progress of Switch emulation on Android. So I invite you to join me, Rob the Retro Tech Dad, as we explore the potential of Switch emulation on the Anbernic RG556 with the Sudachi emulator. So before we begin, I always like to go through the setup process and then talk about some settings and provide some tips. The goal of this video was to explore the potential of Switch emulation on the RG556, and I also wanted to see if we can add to the list of playable games for the device, especially when coming from prior generation handhelds with the older Unisoc T618, which could handle a limited number of Switch games. If you're curious about which games those are, I will have them linked in the description and the video itself. Let's go ahead and head on over to the Sudachi Git page, which I will have linked down in the description. I will also have the website for Sudachi linked in the description, which is probably the best place to go for the latest releases and news, especially since GitHub has not been very reliable in the past when it comes to hosting these files. Now, Sudachi is fairly new, and there's only been a few releases since version 1 back in April, but Sudachi is essentially the spiritual successor to Yuzu, and in its short time has already added functionality for new releases. Okay, so on this page, scroll down and then click on the Android releases link, which at the time of creating this video is version 1.0.2, and it is the version that I use to test every game in this showcase. Once you've clicked on the link, the file should download and you should end up with sudachi-ea-release.apk. You can download this directly to your RG556 using a browser like Chrome. Once downloaded, click on the APK file to install. You might have to give permission to install the files. Once you've done that, Sudachi should install without issue. Now the first thing that greets you is an old friend, but we will ignore that and click on Get Started to proceed. The initial setup process is very similar to Yuzu. I usually bypass the notifications part and then continue on. For Sudachi, you will still need to provide your own prod keys, and of course, I cannot share how or where to get these from, but a quick internet search should get you to where you need to go. In the next section, you can add your directory that has all of your games. I personally like to create a folder called Switch and then point to that directory. Your main screen should look something like this, but before we talk about games, let's go to the gear icon at the top left corner to access the settings. For advanced settings, I usually leave these at default as I find it's much easier to set per game settings since we do have games that use various settings. But let's run through what our default settings should look like. For system, an important setting to pay attention to here is the docked mode option, which will allow you to run games in either handheld or docked mode. For this video, we will be using handheld mode for every game in this showcase, and so you can go ahead and keep this toggle off. Everything else here should remain at default. Let's go back and now head into graphics. Every setting here will also remain at default. Now the option to pay the most attention to is going to be the resolution setting. Here we can adjust the multipliers of the resolution, and given that we are working with the 556 and the T820, we are obviously not going to be doing any kind of upscaling. Instead, we will be utilizing options such as the 0.5x and 0.75x native resolution. The majority of the games in this showcase will either be using 0.75x and 1x, but I will let you know throughout the showcase which setting I am using. For now, leave this at 1x, which is the default. Every other setting here will be left at default. And there's actually only one game in this showcase that specifically needs a setting to be adjusted, which is for Grindstone, and we will be utilizing the SMAA anti-aliasing method, which can be found here in the graphics section. Let's back out again, and we will be skipping the audio section as we do not need to make any adjustments here. Let's head into the debug section, and for every game in this showcase, we will be using the Vulkan API with the native code execution as the CPU backend. Everything here will be left at default for this showcase. Okay, back in settings and beside the advanced settings, we have the ability to map our controls. Sudachi does provide an automatic mapping feature that I find works quite well, but in case your controls are not mapped correctly, this is the section to go into and adjust as needed. Now, an important section here in settings is the Manage Sudachi data. If we click on this, here we can install protkeys in case you skip that step in the initial setup. Most importantly, you can load your Switch firmware here by clicking on Install Firmware and then pointing to the zip file that contains the Switch firmware. Some games will not start or run without the Switch firmware installed, and so this is a very important step that is, in my opinion, required. But the nice thing for the Switch firmware is that you do not need to unzip the firmware files. Sudachi will be able to read and load the zip file as is. You can easily find the Switch firmware files on the internet. Unfortunately, I cannot share the firmware here. For this video, I am using the 18.0.0 firmware. A few other things to pay attention to here in this section is the ability to export or import your save data from games. Okay, let's go back to the Sudachi main screen and talk about per game settings, which I definitely recommend the way to go for most of the titles that deviate from the native 1x setting. So for example, Animal Well is a game that does require the 0.75x resolution setting, and we can assign a per game setting by holding down on the game icon and then making adjustments as needed on this new screen. Another thing you can do with per game settings is install any download content or game updates that you might have by clicking on add-on and then click on the install icon at the bottom right of the screen. Not only that, but for any installed updates or DLC, you can actually toggle them on or off as needed. So we're all done here, but I did want to mention one last thing related to the settings. I wanted to keep things nice and simple for this video. And so again, every game tested here runs using the handheld mode setting in Sudachi. In addition, I have the CPU toggled on to the high mode in the quick settings on the RG556. I will detail any other settings throughout the video, including resolution as needed. Finally, before we head on over to the game's showcase, I wanted to set some expectations, as Sudachi is definitely a work in progress, and so much like other Switch emulators, expect that things like random crashes, poor performance, games that don't load properly, and other issues to be the norm here. This is strictly meant to be a bonus on a device like the Anbernic RG556, and while the games that follow run mostly well, you can still expect there to be issues, and so this is not a definitive list of playable games. It is worth mentioning that a lot of games that I tested but didn't include here were very close to being playable at full speed, but unfortunately the 556 doesn't have quite the power to get us to that point. But maybe in the future, as the emulator progresses and becomes further optimized, the 556 can see more of the library open up. But enough of that, let's get into this surprisingly larger than I was expecting showcase of games. I'm pretty excited to start this showcase out with a game that I believe hasn't had the honor of doing so on the channel, and it's a nice change of pace from the usual Advance Wars, which, by the way, is coming up shortly. A Short Hike is an absolutely charming indie game from Canadian developer Adam Yu, and is an adventure game that has you exploring this open world while trying to get a cell phone reception, and so you need to reach the top of the mountain in order to do so. This sets up our journey perfectly as we take control of a bird named Claire in what I describe as the perfect cozy game, and I'm pretty sure that my friend Crystal over at Crystal is Cozy and Stuff either loves this game or now has a new one to add to her growing list of cozy adventures. For me, one of the standout aspects of this game is the gorgeous graphics that uses this low poly art style, and it just perfectly ties the whole adventure together. The best part is that a Short Hike runs very well on our Anbernic RG556, and I have this one set up to use the 1x native resolution without any issues. Now let's continue on with a game that is usually my opener for a lot of these Switch showcases. Advance Wars Reboot Camp is back on the channel, and very much a pleasant surprise to see here running on the 556, which I had my reservations about. But with Sudachi, we are set to use the Switch's native resolution, and framerate is mostly steady. In the overworld segments, framerate is locked at 30 frames per second, and then the battle scenes are around 30 frames per second. On a real Switch, it does switch between 30 and 60 frames per second, but never actually reaches full speed during those battle scenes. It's the same thing here, but I think it's a fair compromise since the battle scenes don't really impact gameplay, and so you might as well enjoy the higher resolution. Advance Wars will be one of the only few Nintendo games being featured here in this video. Animal Well is a nice last-minute inclusion for this showcase, as the developer behind Sudachi actually addressed an issue with the game in a recent update, and I'm really glad that it's now working here with Sudachi. Animal Well is a recent release that completely blew me away, and I've been enjoying this one quite a bit on both my Switch and on PC. Animal Well is a Metroidvania style game that brings with it all the great exploration that one would expect to find in this genre. For me, one of the absolute standouts was the graphics engine that has all sorts of impressive effects going on, and I just love taking a moment really appreciating the world and how things interact, which is a lot of fun on its own. Animal Well isn't full speed here on the RG556, and this footage is of the game running at 0.75x resolution, which is a good compromise between prioritizing visuals and performance. Despite AnimOL not running at a full 60 frames per second, this game is still very playable, and I've actually gone through a portion of the game on here without any real issues. The OLED display of the 556 really makes this game stand out visually, and it's such a treat. Beacon Pines is our next game on the list, and I'm so excited to finally feature this one for the first time on the channel. Beacon Pines is a gem of a game that comes to us from Hiding Spot Games, and it's best described as a narrative adventure game that uses turning points as moments where you can change the outcome of the story within the realm of a storybook. This game has great and charming visuals, and for those that enjoy a bit more of a narrative experience, I definitely recommend Beacon Pines, which mostly does well here on the RG556 using the native resolution. It's very area dependent, but for the most part we are at a full 60 frames per second, and given the pacing and style of the game, I don't mind when we're dipping below 60 here. You can definitely use 0.75x resolution, but you might as well enjoy the higher resolution with this game. Binding of Isaac Afterbirth Plus builds on the prior Afterbirth expansion with additional content and features. This Switch port came out very early on in the console's life, and a game that has been fairly consistent with Switch emulation in terms of stability and compatibility. On the Anbernic RG556, things are looking very solid with the game set to use 1x native resolution, and so it's another game that doesn't require much in the way of tweaking any settings. The game is essentially locked to its full 60 frames per second, and so it runs great here, and I have to say the visuals look super sharp on this awesome OLED display. Blasphemous is another game that I haven't featured in some time, but it's always one that's fun to talk about. Blasphemous is a Metroidvania style game from the Game Kitchen and brings awesome visuals and a very satisfying combat style. Blasphemous does have a sequel that was released on the Switch as well, but unfortunately that game did have some graphical issues. In fact, the issues in the second game used to plague the first one, so it is nice to see that it's no longer an issue, at least with the original game. Blasphemous is set to use the Switch's native resolution, and gameplay is mostly steady at the full 60 frames per second. Blooodrayne Betrayal returns to the channel in another Switch showcase, and it's definitely been a game that has been a solid performer across various devices that I've personally tested. Blooodrayne Betrayal is always a favorite of mine to showcase because we have WayForward handling development duties for this one, and it's a nice departure for the Blooodrayne series, with WayForward opting to go 2D side-scrolling, and as is the norm with WayForward games, we have great art and gameplay. The Fresh Bites version improves on the complaints with the original game, namely with its difficulty. I do have Blooodrayne Betrayal set to use the 0.75x resolution, as I felt it was the best balance between visuals and performance. This game does occasionally have some flicker in-game, but it's nowhere near as bad as I've seen in other games, and so I still think it's worth an inclusion here. Cat Quest 2 is another game making a return here, and I'm really glad that this one does work pretty well with the RG556. The original Cat Quest was released natively on the Google Play Store, but unfortunately this sequel here is an Apple Arcade exclusive, and so this Switch port is the closest we will get to enjoying it on Android devices, and thankfully Cat Quest 2 does perform quite well in general. Cat Quest 2 is an action RPG, which as its name implies has you taking on the role of a cat, and a dog as well. This is a fun time that I find pretty laid back with an awesome combat system. I do have Cat Quest 2 set to use 0.75x native resolution, since much like Blooodrayne I felt it offered the best balance between graphics and performance. This is another game that had the flickering issue happen in-game occasionally, but it's very minor and it doesn't take away from the gameplay. I don't think many will be surprised by this next inclusion, but it's been a while since I've talked about Celeste, so I decided to include it here because I really do love this game. Celeste began life as a Pico 8 game, which by the way is a very awesome game as well. And what's not to love with Celeste? It's got charming graphics, beautiful music, and an equally beautiful story and meaning, with very satisfying gameplay that has you wanting to try levels out just one more time. Celeste has been a very steady and stable game when it comes to Switch emulation, being one of the earliest playable games. Here on the RG556, we have Celeste running at native resolution, and unsurprisingly there's not too much issue here with this one. Dave the Diver made some waves last year when it first dropped on Steam, with a Nintendo Switch port that followed a few months later. As the name suggests, you play as Dave, and yes, you are a diver, but there are two parts to this game, with the other having you manage a sushi restaurant. It combines a lot of different gameplay elements, which comes together to make this one a pretty addictive and surprisingly very relaxing game. I also happen to know the real-life Dave the Diver. He goes by the name of Mikhailov and runs this really cool YouTube channel called Team Retro. Anyways, Dave the Diver has great pixel style graphics, and here on the Anbernic RG556, we are able to play this one at 0.75x native resolution without too much issue, and again, it's just a matter of balancing visuals and performance. The End is Nigh comes to us from the same minds behind Super Meat Boy, and so for fans of that game, I highly recommend checking out The End is Nigh, which has been described as a spiritual successor to Super Meat Boy, and definitely carries over the same types of challenges, which results in an addictive gameplay hook that has you wanting to try levels over and over again until you pass them. The End is Nigh is another game that works fantastic here on the RG556, with the game set to use 1x native resolution and stays stable throughout gameplay. This game in particular is a nice showcase of the OLED display thanks to the colors that are being used here. And Fez is definitely not a stranger to the channel and has been featured so many times I think I've lost count at this point. But that's a good thing, as Fez is definitely one of the best games ever created, especially when talking about indie games. After first releasing way back in 2012, Fez has been ported to many platforms, but unfortunately still never saw a release on Android, and so this Switch version remains one of the ways we can enjoy it on Android-based devices. Luckily, I've found Fez to be a fairly stable and consistent game more recently with Switch emulation. The gameplay mechanics and visuals have always been a treat, and even more so on this awesome OLED display. I did set Fez to use 0.75x native resolution, as I found that performance was rock solid using that resolution setting. Otherwise, this game is running quite well on the 556. Fire Emblem Engage is the second Nintendo published and developed game making this showcase, and there will not be a whole lot of them here. For whatever reason, Fire Emblem Engage has been an incredibly consistent performer across multiple devices and does surprisingly a lot better than expected with emulation, especially on Android. The same holds true for this game on the RG556 and settles nicely using the 0.75x resolution setting with not a whole lot of performance issues. It's definitely an awesome title to see running here, as Fire Emblem Engage is quite the meaty game, and for tactical RPG fans it's well worth checking out. Engage is the 17th entry in the Fire Emblem series, and so if you're a fan of Fire Emblem, you should be pretty happy to see that this one does run on the 556. Freedom Planet 2 is the long-awaited sequel to the original game, and it finally received a port to platforms outside of PC just this year. Freedom Planet 2 in many ways is an improvement over the first one, which already was a pretty awesome game on its own. With the sequel, the game takes on more of its own identity, moving away from its Sonic the Hedgehog inspirations, but still feels very much like a Genesis-era game. The visuals here are a real treat on the OLED display, and this game is a clear labor of love, and it definitely shows why it was in development for several years. Freedom Planet 2 is running here on the 556 at 1x native resolution setting, and the game runs great, looks beautiful, and has no issues at all on this device. This is definitely not the first time that I've talked about or featured Golf Story, and it makes a return for this video since it's not only a great game, but one that has been consistently working quite well on a range of devices. Golf Story takes me back to the Game Boy Color version of Mario Golf, which of course is where Golf Story draws much of its inspiration from. It's also a Nintendo Switch exclusive, and so outside of the Nintendo Switch, there is no other place to play this game. Golf Story in particular looks really great because of its art style, and it just pops on this OLED display. Here on the RG556, this game is running very well at native resolution, mostly staying close to or locked at that 60 frames per second. Grindstone is another great game that began its life as an Apple Arcade exclusive and then eventually found its way to other platforms. Unfortunately, because this was an Apple exclusive at first, we will probably not see this one release on Android, and so this Nintendo Switch version is the next best option we have to get this game on Android devices. Which is a shame because Grindstone is a fantastic puzzle game that is well worth checking out. Now this game does need some specific settings to be adjusted so that it works properly. The anti-aliasing method needs to be set to SMAA, which will resolve the issue with the flickering in-game. Unfortunately, this method is a bit demanding and does impact performance, but thankfully with a game like Grindstone, it's not as difficult to run, and so we still can enjoy this one at full speed with 0.75x native resolution for the best performance. But even at 1x native resolution, the game still hovers in the 50s range, so it's really just a matter of preference. The footage here is of the game running at 0.75x resolution. Guacamelee has been a long-time favorite of mine and has been featured many times here on the channel. Guacamelee isn't a particularly new game, but to me it's an indie classic at this point. Guacamelee is a Metroidvania-style game with an emphasis on more action and has fantastic visuals which can probably be tied to its Mexican folklore inspiration. At this point, Guacamelee has been on tons of platforms, but to this day still does not have an Android release of any kind, And so, thanks to Sudachi, Guacamelee is now playable here. Similar to Golf Story, this has been a fairly consistent performer when it comes to Switch emulation, and it does run on quite a number of devices. Here on the RG556, I have the game set to use native resolution, and it does run very well. Here's a pretty cool one for RPG fans, and this was a very early release on the Nintendo Switch, which dropped as a launch title for the platform and comes to us from the RPG masters at Square Enix. This was developed by the Tokyo RPG Factory and is very much an homage to classic RPGs like Chrono Trigger. One of the key things here is that the game utilizes an active time battle system, but there are definitely other elements that give it a very classic RPG feel, including a pretty memorable soundtrack that used mostly the piano to convey its generally somber theme. The game uses its snowy landscape to further drive home that theme of sadness. The studio unfortunately closed down this year, but it did release 2 additional titles, including Lost Sphere and Oninaki, but I Am Setsuna specifically is the title that I personally tested on the RG556, and this one performed better than I was expecting, with it running at the 1x native resolution setting and only experienced occasional dips here and there because of some special effects on screen. Okay, this next game is a pretty unique and probably relatively unheard of game for the Switch. The Night Witch is an interesting blend of genres that mixes a Metroidvania with a shoot 'em up, and it's probably not much of a surprise for my longtime viewers that this game is one that I enjoy quite a bit, as it mixes 2 genres that I really love. And beyond it being an awesome game, the visuals are absolutely stunning with its hand-drawn art. There's a lot to like here, and for those used to Metroidvanias, this might be a bit different to get used to because of it being a shmup, and as such, there isn't any platforming here. In fact, a reviewer called this one a shmup-troidvania, and I'd say that's quite on point. The game mixes everything surprisingly well with a solid story and tight gameplay, but be warned, it can be difficult, but thankfully there's an in-game cheat menu that can be used in case you're having trouble. I did have to turn the resolution down for this one, and I recommend going with a 0.75x native resolution since this game is a bit more demanding than it seems. So I actually went back and forth about whether or not I should include Mario vs. Donkey Kong, which is an awesome remake of the original Game Boy Advance release from back in the day. Mario vs. Donkey Kong is actually a puzzle platform game where you have to guide Mario through challenges to help rescue mini Marios from Donkey Kong. As you progress, the levels naturally become more difficult and vary with different challenges to overcome. Now, the reason why I said I was indecisive about including this game for this showcase has to do with its need to run at 0.5x native resolution. It's one of only 2 games that I've included in this video that require it so that you can get decent enough performance. Despite the 0.5x resolution, I felt like this game didn't suffer too much from that drop in resolution, and therefore I ultimately decided to include this because it's a very fun game that's cool to see here running on the RG556. Even though this game is set to 0.5x resolution, we are still not at a full 60 frames per second, but given the type of game here, I don't think it's much of a problem. Now, there's nothing like a good Mega Man game, and especially one that is a sequel to the original mainline games, but with all the great enhancements that come with it being a fairly recent release. Mega Man 11 features beautiful 2.5D style graphics and lots of modern features that makes it a very nice addition to the Mega Man franchise. This is basically what you would expect from a Mega Man game as you traverse through various stages and take on different robot bosses in each stage. For the 556, I have Mega Man 11 set to use 0.75x native resolution, and despite it not being a full 60 frames per second, we are pretty close here, and this one does run decent enough. I didn't notice much performance improvement dropping down to 0.5x, and so it's probably best to stay at 0.75x to balance the visuals and performance. Mini Motorways is another one of those games that I could just talk about forever and feature it over and over again, which I've certainly done quite a bit here, as both Mini Metro and its sequel Mini Motorways have solidified themselves into my rotation of games I can always pick up and play and get hooked on all over again. Mini Motorways is a very interesting concept that requires you to build a road network to get commuters from their homes to their place of work as efficiently as possible. The game has this great minimalistic art style, but most importantly, the gameplay is addictive and surprisingly very relaxing. This is one I can always pick up when I want to kill some time or just take it easy before bed. With Mini Motorways, I have the game set to use 0.75x native resolution, and it does mostly pretty well at this setting, and again, it's a choice to balance between performance and maintaining the visuals on this beautiful display. Now, it's definitely no secret that I love my shooters, and Neverawake is one of those gems that probably many don't know about. Neverawake is a twin-stick shooter with absolutely stunning hand-drawn graphics that not only looks great visually, but lends itself very well to the satisfying gameplay that we get here. This game is perfect for a handheld as the levels are short, The gameplay is simple, but it's balanced out perfectly with the right amount of challenge as well as having tons of content that is available. There's lots of cool weapons and accessories, and the entirety of the adventure is well worth going through. We've truly got some shmup goodness here. Now, it's probably not all too surprising, but like many other games here, I am set to use 0.75x native resolution, and yes, again, this one isn't quite the full 60 frames per second. But again, it's a balance, and I feel that it is acceptable and definitely playable. Now, you may or may not have noticed, but there haven't been a whole lot of Nintendo developed and published entries on this list, and that's because most of those games are quite demanding and just don't run well on the RG556. New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe is actually very much like Mario vs. Donkey Kong, and I sort of thought twice about its inclusion here. This will actually be the last Nintendo game for this showcase, and like Mario vs. Donkey Kong, this game does need to be set at the 0.5x native resolution to run as you see here in the footage. Despite this, the game does run at or close to the full 60 frames per second, which is nice to see. The drop in resolution is noticeable, but nowhere near as bad as on certain other titles, and it's nice to be able to showcase this game running on Android, but most importantly here on the RG556 with its beautiful OLED display. I don't think there's a lot that needs to be said about this entry, as it's classic 2D style Mario platforming goodness, and as a fun fact, it's actually the first entry in the Super Mario series to feature HD graphics way back on its initial release for the Wii U. I'm always excited to include a Rayman game in any showcase, and in particular the more recent releases that utilize the fantastic UbiArt engine. Rayman Legends is the second Rayman game that used UbiArt, as it's a sequel to Rayman Origins, but unfortunately only Legends received a port to Nintendo Switch as the definitive edition. Rayman Legends is such a treat and a great platformer with tons of content, collectibles, and of course silly Rayman fun. The graphics are obviously a highlight here, but the gameplay, level design, and tight controls are absolutely worth mentioning here, and for Rayman fans or just platformer fans in general, there's a lot to love here. Rayman Legends is a decently demanding game that required I drop the resolution down to 0.75x, and while not the most ideal thing here given the art, it still does look very beautiful on the OLED panel of the 556 and it holds up despite the drop in resolution. The game isn't always locked to 60 frames per second, and it is very much area dependent, but overall this is still very playable and a game of this caliber is well worth an inclusion here. It's been some time since I've featured Rogue Legacy 2, and I actually remember testing this one out early on with Skyline over on the T618 handhelds like the RG505 and Retroid Pocket 3 Plus. The game wasn't quite full speed back then, and unfortunately not much has changed here, despite the extra power we have with the T820 in the RG556. Now, I haven't personally tested Skyline with this game, but it's definitely something to consider, but I will say that stability is better here overall, and probably best to stick with Sudachi. For this game, I am set to use 0.75x native resolution, and this is definitely a game where you don't want to go below that as it makes text essentially unreadable, and performance is generally pretty solid, staying up there in the 50s, and as such the game is quite playable. This is really a great game, which is another Metroidvania making the list, but this one has roguelike elements, and so it does offer enough to make it feel different than others in the genre. Personally, I really enjoy Rogue Legacy and its sequel, and I definitely recommend checking it out. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the game, is an awesome side-scrolling beat-em-up from Ubisoft that at one point was actually delisted and unavailable for purchase anywhere. Thankfully, Ubisoft realized how awesome this game is and released the complete edition for a new audience to enjoy, and so it finally made its way over to the Nintendo Switch. Unfortunately, this game never received an Android port, and it's a shame because I think it would be a perfect fit for mobile, similar to Streets of Rage 4. Scott Pilgrim has been a fairly long time a consistent emulation showcase for the Switch on Android back in the early days of both Yuzu and Skyline, and nothing really changes here as this game does run very well with Sudachi at native resolution with no real issues to speak of, and it's a game that is also very stable, and so it's a great one to enjoy here on the RG556. And next on our list is another personal favorite of mine, but also one that has been featured a few times here on the channel. Shovel Knight Dig is a game that I spent most of my time playing on mobile since it was part of Apple Arcade, and it was almost a no-brainer for me since I love this Shovel Knight franchise, but Dig is a different take from the mainline games, and this one draws its influence from games like Spelunky, Dig Dug, and Downwell, but with all of the charm that comes with the Shovel Knight world and characters. Since this is another Apple Arcade exclusive for mobile, Android users are yet again left to emulate this Nintendo Switch version in order to join in on the Shovel Knight Dig fun. This is another game that runs incredibly well with Sudachi on the 556, and I have this game set to use the 1x native resolution, with performance being very good. Slaying Back from Hell is a game that goes hard with its heavy metal soundtrack and over-the-top gore. This is a pretty slick game, especially with its killer visuals. It's probably lower on my personal list of favorites, at least out of the games being featured here in this video, but I still think it's worth checking out, if anything, for that killer soundtrack. The game had a very rough start, but the developers actually went back to work and fixed a lot of the issues that it had initially. This is a no-frills action platformer in the vein of something like Contra, with gory combat, and Slain makes no apologies about that. This is another game that, despite the way it might look, is actually a bit more demanding than it seems, and I did need to turn this one down to use the 0.75x native resolution, which again helps balance out visuals and performance. Spelunky is certainly not a new title, but this enhanced version that was released for various platforms, including the Switch, is definitely the way to go if you're wanting to try this game out. Spelunky is a roguelike platformer that has you taking on the role of the adventurer, where you get to explore procedurally generated caves, doing all of the spelunker goodness. This is one of the earlier games that used the roguelike concepts in this way, and in many ways has influenced roguelike games that came after it. This enhanced version of Spelunky looks great, with it still remaining the charming look of the original release, and on the RG556, this one unsurprisingly runs great on the device, with the game set to use the 1x native resolution and never wavers from its target frame rate. I really enjoy the entire Steamworld franchise, and not much changes here with Steamworld Dig 2. I bet you wouldn't believe it if I told you it's another Metroidvania style game being featured here in this showcase, but Steamworld Dig and the sequel are truly some of the best in the genre. In the sequel, you take control of Dorothy, who needs to find her friend Rusty, the main character from the original game. Now, probably the biggest thing about Steamworld Dig 2 are all of the quality of life improvements coming from the original game, including the ability to travel between teleporters. This is a great game that is well worth playing through, and on the 556 is another solid performer running at the Switch's native resolution without any issues here. Valfaris comes to us from the same developers as Slaying Back from Hell, and taking one look at it, it's pretty easy to see the similarities, which start with the awesome heavy metal inspired soundtrack that goes hard, and the same Contra inspired action platforming with the over-the-top gore. Unlike Slaying, the setting does change here, with Valfaris opting for a sci-fi setting. I'd say that between the two games I actually prefer Valfaris, and I find it to be the better game, and it's clear that the team at Steel Mantis used their experiences from developing Slain to deliver an improved experience with Valfaris. This game, like Slain, has absolutely stunning visuals that look fantastic here on the OLED panel. For Valfaris, and again similar to Slain, I did change the resolution setting to use the 0.75x, as the game can have lots of things happening on screen, and this setting helps smooth things out a bit more while still looking very nice on the 556's screen. Windjammers has always been one of my favorite games for the Neo Geo, and when I found out they were making a sequel to this game, with it being developed by .emu, the same team responsible for the awesome Streets of Rage 4, I was beyond ecstatic. The sequel, simply titled Windjammers 2, turned out better than I could have ever hoped for, with the visuals definitely being one of the highlights here. The gameplay is also very faithful to the original game, and overall this is an awesome experience that allows fans of Windjammers, including myself, to enjoy something new in the series after nearly 30 years. Windjammers is yet another game that has no issues here, running at the 1x native resolution setting, with the performance staying nice and steady at that 60 frames per second. And so we've reached the end of this showcase. I hope that this was a fun look at some of the possibilities of the Unisoc T820 in the RG556, and perhaps maybe even some surprises here with Switch emulation in general on this handheld. As I mentioned when we first started, this is just a fun bonus to explore on a device like the RG556, and with its OLED display is definitely worth looking at. I also hope that with this new list of games that perhaps some gems had a spotlight and can become someone else's next favorite game. I'm also pretty sure that this won't be the last time that we talk about Switch emulation on the channel, but until the next Switch showcase, as always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.